Today's session on the 7th of June is MapMyProgramme, Developing the Holistic Student Assessment Experience. And our presenter today is Mark Kerrigan from Anglia, Ruskin University in the UK. So Mark, would you like to begin, please? Hello, Mark.
Yeah, hi Matthew. Good morning. How are you? So hopefully you can all hear me, and thank you very much for the invitation to say hello today. So I'm currently based in the UK, so I'm a little bit confused about mornings, afternoons, evenings, and other such things. So just hi. So yeah, so what I want to do this morning is just talk a little bit about MapMyProgramme and some work that we've been doing in the UK, where I work currently around assessment mapping and the student experience. As Matthew said, there's going to be some opportunities for discussion, both text chat and then potentially some audio discussion as well. It would be great to hear from you as well. So onwards and upwards. So the MapMyProgramme, as I say, we're looking at the sort of holistic student assessment experience. And one of the reasons of why we sort of started this was very much thinking about what are students' expectations when they come to university, and how do we then think about managing their expectations. So with that in the context and the background, the sort of aims or thoughts for today really are some overview thoughts on assessment. I have to admit, I had a quick look at the delegate list, and there's some amazing people who know a lot about assessment. So we'll have a few thoughts on there, but there's a lot of other expertise and knowledge in the room, which is absolutely brilliant. Some ideas around the sort of student experience, and again around the sort of holistic assessment experience. Assessment planning, feed forward, feedback, and that works. Something that we did at the University of Greenwich around the great assessment experience, which was quite good fun, and I quite like acronyms, and it'd be good to explore that. Course assurance, and then the idea is to talk about MapMyProgramme, a live demo to see actually how it works, and then a discussion at the end. So that's the plan for the next bit of time. So hopefully that sounds okay, and we'll give it a go. So. Before we begin, also just as a sort of background, this work, I currently work at Anglia, Ruskin University. A lot of this work was developed at the University of Greenwich when I worked in the Educational Development Unit, working with two absolutely wonderful people called Simon Walker and Rita Headington. So at the bottom of the slide, there's references to where these things have been done as well, which I think is important to do. But as I say, I currently work at Anglia Ruskin, so just to give you an idea of where I am. This is Anglia Ruskin University, so we do snapshots every now and then. So we have 5 faculties at this university. We're sort of based in the southeast of England. I have quite a few students, and there's some sort of demographics if you're interested about the university, which is, I have to admit, a wonderful place to work. So why assessment mapping? And this was a question to begin with. And really it does boil down to the sort of holistic views of a course, and a lot of sort of conversations around when people either design a course, revalidate a course, and actually look at sort of assessment strategies that they're using, and very much focusing on sort of what are the assessment types that are being used, are there sort of over-reliance of assessment types, and how do you sort of surface this information quite easily. Assessment timings, again, there's a lot of discussion around sort of assessment bunching, workload bunching for students, workload bunching for academic colleagues, engaging with marking. And there are also some areas around courses or programs which have multiple options. So there's a lot of potentially some anxiety or issues around students who have sort of core modules which are mapped, and then varying on options that they undertake can actually impact their assessment experience. How do you manage those? Since I'm using the word course and programs, what I'll do, just for consistency, I'll use the phrase programs and modules. So a program comprises modules, and hopefully that answers your question, Tim, and sorry for the confusion. Then also the issue of assessment weightings. There's a wonderful work done via JISC and something in the University of Hertfordshire, which I'd like to touch on around sort of assessment weightings and assessment risk. And then more recently, sort of assessment literacy and that bigger area of how assessment then feeds into a program. There's sort of staff views, and then importantly, more sort of student assessment literacy as well. So student planning, managing their workload, and actually thinking about their development during a program. So Thinking about the student experience, within the UK, we obviously measure the student experience through the NSS. And this is a graph from 2016, and there's been a good positive trend in a lot of places around the student experience on NSS. So we actually ask our graduates, or our soon-to-be graduates, their assessment experiences. And sort of looking at these sorts of data here, we're still under the 80% threshold for sort of supporting assessment, communicating it, and so forth. And one of the things that sort of is driving this work is thinking, how can we sort of either design assessment to support a better student experience around here as well. I don't really want to touch on the NSS too much. So going right back to the beginning and thinking about, why do students choose university and why do students choose a degree? And I think that's a really important place to begin when thinking about sort of assessment mapping. So I keep pressing the wrong button on this keyboard, sorry. There we go. So students, they choose a degree with an absolutely fantastic sounding name. They have a vision for what they want to do, a vision for what they want to contribute to the world, where they potentially want to end up, and they choose a degree that really does support their vision for what they want to be, which is absolutely wonderful. And we've all been involved in program design and so forth. They then get to university, and in many cases we say, welcome to your fantastic degree with a sounding name, and now your degree, by the way, comprises of lots of modules. So we have your degree, which is then comprised potentially of 8 modules per year, so 24 modules over the period of time. And each of your modules will have a teaching team, potentially different types of students, and lots of coursework. So the question we then have is, students are entering university with this concept of this holistic degree, which they've been looking forward to study potentially for a very many large number of years, and then we automatically then begin to break it down. Okay, we have a modular degree program, but thinking about modular degrees and potentially the first year of a degree program, I'm fairly confident that all our modules, they all communicate well with each other, they all talk together, the teams communicate, the students communicate, and the coursework is designed beautifully. Would you agree with that assumption? Just put your hands up if you think, yes, that is a realistic view of we think. I'm getting a we wish from somebody. Okay. Alternatively, we could say we have our 8 modules per year with these brilliant teaching teams, all these students and these coursework, and instead they're beginning to potentially operate in silos. So the communication may not be as good as one would like to be between each of these modules. So the students coming into university has one expectation of this program that they're very excited to be doing, and then we end up delivering almost mini degrees. So assessment mapping for us was really thinking about how we can then getting these things to actually really talking together, how we can actually sort of surface the information and so forth. Which sort of asks the first question that I really want to ask you. Some of you said, no, this isn't reality. Other of you are saying, yes, maybe so. The question that would be interesting to ask would be, what actually holds a degree program together? So we have all these modules which make up a degree program. What is the glue that keeps everything together? So I'm going to stop talking for a second, and if you could just have a quick go in the chat box, that would be absolutely wonderful. Okay, so lots of ideas flying in there, which is absolutely brilliant. So some of it is talking about the students, the communication, the importance of a course leader, a certificate at the end of the program, potentially assessment, formative and scientific mentioned by Jill, Single discipline may be easier than across schools or departments. And it varies from case to case. I think a lot of the mentioned so far is valid, but not universal. I would agree with that. Different institutions in different contexts do differ as well. Yes, it's a complex system, so very much case by case. So this is a sort of question that really underpinned a lot of the assessment work and the assessment mapping. And it got us to thinking what actually does hold a program together. And there's sort of three areas that sort of really resonated with me. And the first one is sort of based from some of the work from the University of Westminster, which was a JISC project working with a gentleman called Gunter Saunders. And personal tutors were actually found to be one of the very sort of strong glues that hold a course together. They're the consistent member of staff that hopefully a student will have throughout their degree program. And their role is potentially to provide links between modules, supporting with assessment. And the idea is the project at Westminster actually used personal tutors to help provide strategy on students' feedback, which was an interesting thing to do. The other one, obviously academic content, sort of flow of subject material, growth in knowledge and skills and so forth. And then assessment was the other one, which I think really does act as sort of the program glue. It can sort of look forward, so it helps students to plan forward their degree, also providing a mechanism of reflection as well, sort of benchmarks of their own development throughout their program. Obviously, it can potentially span modules too. And also it's actually owned by students as well. So a lot of the assessment, the feedback they get, the way students actually engage with it, the way they work forward, is actually something tangible that the students can have and they can actually control. And I think that's quite an important thing to think about as well. So moving on forward on that concept, that potentially assessment, as someone else identified, yes, that summative and formative assessment really can act as one part of the glue that holds all those modules together. It then sort of leads us on to a little bit of mapping. So what I'd like to show you is, this is actually based on some work from the University of Hertfordshire by a gentleman called Mark Russell. And it was an escape project which was just funded. And he was looking at, he and Dominic were looking at what they called high risk, medium risk, or low risk assessments. And whereby sort of high risk assessments are sort of near the end of a module carrying a lot of weighting, low risk are potentially earlier on, or smaller weightings and so forth. And then exactly sort of work that we're doing is then thinking about within one module, if you have more than one assessment, how does that one assessment then feed forward into the next one? And then very importantly, how does one then sort of feed into a different module across? Because if a module leader has more than one assessment module, that's fairly straightforward. We're seeing it's very easy for that to be planned and designed. But if we have lots of modules running with maybe 2 or 3 different types of module leaders, actually getting that feedback spanning different modules can be quite complicated. Which then sort of leads to a question that I would like to ask, or something that we've been thinking about in our faculty recently, is how do we support our course leaders or our module leaders to make these links? So the question I'd like to ask is, when providing feedback to our students, colleagues can name a future assessment whereby students can apply their feedback. How true do you feel that statement is? And there should be some voting buttons. Okay, thank you for voting in that one. So looking at the scores that came in via the voting one as well. So we have, oh, thanks, Matthew. That's much easier. So looking at it, so two participants say all colleagues are able to provide that piece of work. A couple of you say that most, and then the majority of you are saying some, and then quite a few of you are saying a few, and then 18 of you didn't vote or put it in the text chat. And that's something we sort of been reflecting on as well, and we found that the same sort of area, whereby what we wanted to do was actually provide a way of making it easier for those to actually, when writing their feedback, actually to identify and move things forward. So a piece of work we've actually done in our faculty here is we have a sort of very light touch scaffolding for assessment feedback, and one of the areas that our colleagues fill in is actually a module whereby students can apply. So when they get their feedback back, it actually has a named area where they can actually put it into practice. But for staff to actually find that information out and then move it forward, yes, that can sometimes be a little bit challenging to do. So thinking then around trying to make it easier for staff to sort of communicate where students can move their assessment forward, that was one area that really drove the sort of assessment mapping and MapMyProgramme. The other area that was quite interesting, and this was some thoughts that we had at the University of Greenwich, really was around the phases of assessment. So here we have a sort of a timeline, so you can imagine time going along the bottom. And one of the thoughts that we were exploring was students go through different phases when an assessment is set, when it's submitted, and then it's marked. I think if I press the button again, that will rotate, so you won't have to have your heads on one side. So some of the phases that we were exploring is you have a sort of introductory phase of an assessment, so that's introduced by the module leader. Then it's quite novel and quite exciting, so you may have a good burst of student activity around there, exploring that. Then potentially a planning phase, and then that may then go into a sort of reduced activity phase whereby you've done some original planning or it's not as shiny as and exciting as it could be, and that moves into a second planning phase, and then the actual sort of getting it done, getting it submitted, and so forth. And obviously the coursework is then submitted. Then you have what we call the, thank goodness it's over, or the post-submission relief phase, or it's done. And then potentially sort of anxiety around, okay, I submitted my coursework, I wonder how I did, what is my grade going to be, am I going to pass, will I be able to progress next year, am I still going to be okay to get the first class honours, and so forth. There's a comment from Matthew, high activity is so long, more like the night before, I wouldn't like to comment. And then students get their coursework back, and so sort of results phase, and that could be discussions with the people who get it from their feedback and feed forward. And then hopefully a sort of strategic phase whereby students are looking at how they can then apply their feedback to then support their future success, either in the same module or a different module. And that's definitely one of the areas where assessment mapping comes into place. So thinking about those sorts of phases of assessment, what we then can start to think a little bit about is if you have multiple assessments running in a program, and going back to the sort of maps I was looking at earlier, you end up having these phases overlapping. And so this is just an example of a course that has lots of exams at the end, so they're all overlapping at the same time. And the standard questions that we all ask is reflection on learning, where is the learning, personal development, and sort of the integration and so forth. And we've all had those conversations. But what I was quite interested about is whereby a lot of us are sort of moving assessment hand-in days to avoid bunching, which is absolutely brilliant, great for staff and for students. So if you then take these sorts of assessment phases and then put them onto a map as well, what I was quite interested in is the sort of overlap between these different phases. So we may have staggered submission deadlines, but how does the phase of one assessment impact the activity on another one? So to give you some examples around here, so if you're looking at the screen on the first two modules in modules 1 and 3, in that one we just have two deadlines at the same time, and that's not necessarily a bad thing depending on the type of the assessment, the duration that students were given to do, and so forth, but it's interesting to reflect. But I was quite interested in potentially that the next one, well, by looking at modules 1 and 2, we've staggered the assessment hand-in date, so that's good news. There's less bunching, but there's sort of anxiety that students may be having submitted their first assessment in module 1, may then actually overlap with a sort of high production phase for a second module. So that was the question that we're sort of beginning to think about: is the impact of module 1 actually impacting the effectiveness of module 2, for example? Lauren's just commented, we've all had students miss a class due to submission. Very much so. I can relate to that as well. So then module 2 and module 3, that one whereby the assessment dates have been staggered in a way whereby the sort of planning and strategic phase of an assessment actually begins to overlap with the planning phase of an assessment in another module. So that I've highlighted that on green as seems to be working quite well. And again, module 1 and 2, looking at the last assessment, we again have the sort of overlap of activity. So we've staggered potential dates, but the sort of novelty and the activity of the assessment in module 1 is overlapping with a high intensity activity of module 2. So that was quite interesting for us, getting to think about, we're very good at trying to avoid assessment bunching, both supporting the student and the staff assessment experience. But these sort of assessment theories, assessment experiences, phases, was something that we're beginning to ponder. And Paul saying, perhaps having a high activity phase during the anxiety phase means I won't have time to worry. Okay. So that was another activity that we're thinking about with assessment mapping. And then the last one for me, obviously we're talking about assessment types and bunching and so forth, was actually sort of thinking assessment in outside just of discipline-specific activities. So in Greenwich, we were exploring something referred to as great assessment, whereby assessment could support graduate attributes, retention, employability, attainment, transferable skills, or transition, depending on what you want the T to be. And these sorts of acronyms are quite interesting. So going back to that concept of assessment being the glue that holds a program together, assessment, as well as developing program knowledge, can also help support the student experience or the student journey through their program as well. And this was something that we were beginning to do, or begin to think about it at least. So a question that I would like to ask, sort of building on this and thinking about when we're designing our courses or supporting colleagues to design courses and so forth, is when designing an assessment, how do we capture the sort of non-discipline learning, be that the graduate development and so forth? And I'll just give you a second or two to have a go in the chat box. As you're typing, there was one question around what do I mean by capture. And for that, I'm either talking about how do we articulate to students that this assignment, as well as helping you learn how to use a microscope, but it's also developing X or supporting Y, and how do we either communicate those, build that into our planning, or how do students actually sort of evidence the sort of activities around there. Someone's referring these sort of things as soft skills as well. So I'll give you a couple more seconds. So just having a quick look at the chat. So students, either observations or blogs or reflection, bringing their own context into design. the way learning outcomes have been written, potentially learning outcomes that actually target these sorts of things as well, and support the assessment of these. A really interesting comment by Claire A. number 2. A lot of academics who see content as king, and these sorts of things potentially as less visible. And so forth. So that was something. Interesting one question, Chris. I learned a lot from those answers. How do you mark, or do you mark? Something like a reflective journal. That would be an interesting one to pick up in the discussion, actually, Chris. So that got us thinking again around assessment, and that was, I'm not going to say from the beginnings of MapMyProgramme, but thinking more about the work that we're doing moving forward. But it then got me thinking a little bit around these sorts of areas around here. So if you take a degree program, maybe term 1, term 2, term 3, and then the assessments that you may be doing in module 1, module 2, and module 3, one of the things that I was quite interested in beginning to explore is sort of how can assessments very early on support a transition, or assessment that supports employability, going back to that concept of students enrolling into a degree with a fantastic sounding name. How does assessment can be used to map and manage their expectations around there? So this sort of diagram again has the flows of assessment, and flows of feedback, feed forwards, and linkages between assessments, but thinking a little bit around how assessments can then help develop potentially graduate attributes, digital literacy, or support retention and transition, and so forth. So they're the sort of comments and thoughts that were going through my mind when really thinking about assessment mapping. So what I'd want to do now is just spend a little bit of time on MapMyProgramme and show you what this actually is and how it works. So the idea of MapMyProgramme, going back to the fact that sometimes it's difficult to surface these links around assessments. It can be confusing to find the different types of assessment, the over-reliance assessment modalities, and so forth. We did a bit of work when I was at Greenwich called MapMyProgramme, and the idea was it was a way to help staff and students, if you want to go down to students as well, supporting the design of assessment and feedback. The idea was it to be exceptionally light touch and easy to use, and we chose Google for this work because it is a very collaborative environment, and that was very important because, again, being able to people to work together potentially remotely and so forth was exceptionally important to us. No specialist knowledge was needed, not discipline specific, and as I say, ownership was the whole program team, so it's not just one person owning a spreadsheet and then trying to send that around by email and get it marked and filled in and so forth. So what does it actually look like? As I say, it's a tool for visualizing assessment design, and then it can be incorporated into various activities as well. It comprises an online, very simple Google Sheet, which is a collaborative one, and that can be shared by programs. So looking at the way this often works, course teams actually all have access to the same sheet, which they can then use and fill in those data, which makes it much easier to do. It then generates an automatic report that graphically displays an assessment diet, landscape, and the experiential timeline, and that's really important. And it uses sort of motion and color to display these sorts of things. And the idea is, once you have the base data and the initial experiential timeline, one can then start moving things around, changing things, and actually then see this unfold. And actually, then what does it look like again? So the sort of consequence of the decisions that you're making, and so forth. So we set this up a little while ago, and just some interesting stats which I pulled off Google Analytics yesterday. So this is what it looks like. So it's been bubbling along, and it's had quite a few uses and hits and page views and so forth. Interestingly, according to Google, 102 countries have accessed it. I have to admit, I did look at the stats for that, and I think a few of it is just once by probably one individual, so I wouldn't necessarily get too excited like that. But it's a tool that is being used in various places around the way, and what we do, if people are interested in using it, one can then just request access to it, and that can be done, and people can then just take away and use it for their own work. It's under Creative Commons, so that's not a problem, and so forth. And what it actually does is it produces these sorts of visualization. So you pop your data in. This is just a random splattering of this course doesn't exist. It's just some names I picked out of the top of my head. But you get this sort of visual created. So just to talk you through this, and I'll show you in real time what it looks like. Along the bottom, you have your academic weeks, which goes from, in our case, 0 to 40 or so. Your modules going up the way. Modules have a name. The 1901 is a little thing that popped in from actually using the tool. I've never been able to get rid of it, so just ignore the 1901. But you have your module titles there. Assessment type is then by color, and the assessment weighting is then by the size of the circle as well. And then the idea is you can then explore various combinations and so forth to see what's going on. Interesting question from Deb. How do you manage if the subject runs in multiple courses? That's an interesting point. We had that discussion a while ago around the concept of shared modules and so forth, and that would be good to come back on again in the discussion. So what I'd like to do, if that's okay, is have a go at showing you in real time what this looks like. So if you bear with me for a second, we may have to have a hands up to make sure that you can all see this one. So hopefully you can see my web browser, and I'll just quickly dip back in just to check. Okay. Can you see my web browser?
Hi, Mark. Yes, I think people can. We've got lots of ding, ding, dings, and I can see it on mine, so we're all good.
Wonderful. So what I'll do is not move the window too quickly and so forth. Lots of dingings. Okay, so that sounds positive. That you can see that. So what we have here are a series of tabs and how it works. So when people log in, the first page talks about the assessment types, and this can be populated with any type of assessment that your program can have. And the idea is this sheet is then shared with the entire program team. So module leader 1 can put in their data, module leader 2 can put in their data, and so forth. So there are various tabs along the bottom, and so we have L4 for first year, L5 for second year, L6 for third year. So going in, you end up with something which looks a little bit like this. So scroll back up to the top, whereby you pop in the name of the module leader here, and that will then populate it downwards. The name of the module, pop that in there. That'll populate downwards. How many credits it's worth. Level in the UK, we have levels 4, 5, and 6. So first year, second year, and third year. And then the one that really produces the map is this column here, column G, whereby you have your academic weeks 1 all the way through to 40. And then you literally just go to the week where your assessment is, your drop-down menu. This is automatically populated from when you pop your assessment types in. You just choose the one that you have, and then you put in your weighting, and then finally if it's formative or summative. And what you say, you then complete that for each module. It literally takes a few seconds per module. And if one were then just to scroll down, so we've changed the color, so the first module is green, then it alternates to the second module, which is grayish, and then one goes through and just literally completes that. So you can imagine if you had all your module leaders accessing the same sheet, those data can be populated very quickly, as opposed to lots of emails flying around saying when are your submission dates for this and what assessments you're doing and so forth. The work then, there's some background activity that happens whereby the data is then modified. That all is hidden, but people see it if they want to. But what we want to do is the users be able to focus on their data input and their activities and so forth. You then click on this button, which then gives you the mapping page. So this then pulls up the map. Google made a couple of changes a while ago, so this just has to be set to what you want it to be. So you put course ID along the y-axis, academic week along there, and then assessment weighting. So that's then set up to work, and then you choose which of your modules that you want to look at. So I've set up a few modules, so we'll say I'm going to look at module 1, module 2, module 4, module 5, module 7, and then so I've got module 8 as well, module 8 too. So you select the modules. These things one can move around if you want. As I say, they show the module title, and then when you're ready, you then just hit play. So what this does, this then rolls out your course over the year, and then you can see how many times you have the same color circle, which indicates the same type of assessment. If you have assessments too close to each other, so for example, if we look at modules 7 and 8 over here, okay, the assessment handing dates are staggered, but you've got 1 36, 1 week 35, 1 week 36, and they are 100% weighted, so that could be a challenge for people as well. And then the other thing that we quite like to this is you can then add other modules in. So say, for example, these are your core modules, and you have a whole series of option modules. You can then select different types of module combinations as well, and then see what it looks like. So if the student's doing core 1, 2, option 3, 7, or whatever it would be, you can then really sort of switch on and off these types of scenarios, so you really can see the different experiences that students would have. And that, in a nutshell, is what it looks like. And then the idea is people are then able to use these sorts of maps either to support approval events, move things around, think, oh, okay, I'm using this assessment too often, would it be interesting to change this one to something else, and what does that actually look like? But then asking the sort of bigger questions around how do we prepare students for this type of assessment that we're using if they've never done a joint report before, but that joint report is worth 100% of a module. How do we prepare them for that? Does another module feed into it, and so forth? And there's sort of areas that we are beginning to think about with using this sort of tool. So I need to go back into Collaborate. I think Matthew's going to help me with that one. Wonderful.
I've just clicked the thing back to Collaborate, so I'm not sure if you are back there or not. Mark?
Have the same color circle, which indicates the same type of assessment. If you have assessments too close to each other, so for example, if we look at modules 7 and 8 over here, okay, the assessment handing dates are staggered, but you've got 1 36, 1 week 35, 1 week 36, and they are 100% weighted, so that could be a challenge for people as well. And then the other thing that we quite like to this is you can then add other modules in. So say, for example, these are your core modules, and you have a whole series of option modules. You can then select different types of module combinations as well, and then see what it looks like. So if the student's doing core 1, 2, option 3, 7, or whatever it would be, you can then really sort of switch on and off these types of scenarios, so you really can see the different experiences that students would have. And that, in a nutshell, is what it looks like. And then the idea is people are then able to use these sorts of maps either to support approval events, move things around, think, oh, okay, I'm using this assessment too often, would it be interesting to change this one to something else, and what does that actually look like? But then asking the sort of bigger questions around how do we prepare students for this type of assessment that we're using if they've never done a joint report before, but that joint report is worth 100% of a module. How do we prepare them for that? Does another module feed into it, and so forth? And there's sort of areas that we are beginning to think about with using this sort of tool. So I need to go back into Collaborate. I think Matthew's going to help me with that one. Wonderful.
I've just clicked the thing back to Collaborate, so I'm not sure if you are back there or not. Mark? Are you back in the room, Mark?
Thank you.
Yep.
I am indeed. So what do the coloured horizontal lines represent? That's a question from Debbie. It's just the transition from one type of assessment to another one. They can be switched off if you don't want those on. I leave them on because it's I quite like the colour, to tell you the truth. So that's what MapMyProgramme does. So we also then created we wanted to share this with anybody. So we created a whole host of online resources as well. So there's a website around it. What we've created are how to introduce this to, some instructions for using it, some questions to help potentially guide a team, and also some ideas on how to run a workshop around assessment mapping and the use of MapMyProgramme to support and assessments, and all those sort of things can be downloaded and used as one would like. Can waiting numbers be added? Thank you, Matthew. Yeah. So that's all there, and we'll more than happily circulate the link for that. So the idea is this sort of tool will then really begin to support program teams or students sort of see their assessment experience, think about planning design, and so forth. So the question then for me is what's next, really. So think about where we are with assessment and feedback. We are making good strides in assessment feedback, again reflecting on the NSS and so forth. And assessment literacy, there's a lot of work, exciting work happening around staff assessment literacy, student assessment literacy, and sort of linkages of assessments. So my areas of interest really are beginning to move more around sort of graduate attributes, digital literacy, and employability, thinking about, okay, what some refer to as the sort of potential soft skills, but I think of them more as a sort of co-curriculum, the sort of graduateness, and how is assessment using to help support the development of these sorts of things as well. So thinking of sort of development of sort of graduate attributes and so forth. And just to give you a couple of ideas of things that we're quite interested in here. So one of the things that at Anglia Ruskin is we're very interested in digital literacy. We have a digital literacy framework for the entire university. That's been adopted university-wide. And we're piloting digital badging with digital literacy. So students on the pilot that we run, they undertake an assessment. That assessment has been aligned to a digital literacy framework. If they pass that assessment, and that assessment is subject specific. So for example, that assessment could be writing an essay on X, but by undertaking the essay, you're actually developing digital literacy as well. And then we're beginning to explore badges and how that can work. And then the idea is what we want to do is to support the development of a digitally literate graduate, thinking about how the world is changing and supporting sort of student resilience and so forth. So we can then start thinking digital literacy, yes, is thinking about feedback and feed forward, but these sorts of tools potentially to map digital literacy developments. And that's quite an area that I'm interested in. I think there's a lot of exciting things that one can do around there. And also the other area I'm interested in as well as employability and so forth, is actually simple things like tools. So if we're using digital tools in our modules, how is the learning from one tool supporting the activity of another one? If an assessment has a very high weighting of a digital tool, are digital tools in another module, are they feeding into the learning to support students with those sorts of areas and so forth as well. So those sort of things for me, that's sort of the what next. So what I would like to do now is, that's the last slide from me actually, is hand it over to you for any potential discussion. Thank you.
Mark, can I just, so there was a question earlier about where to get it. So if people go to sites.google.com/mapmyprogramme, is that where they get access to this tool?
Yeah, it is indeed. And then there's a form that one fills in, and then what we then do is we ask for someone's address that they use for Google, and then they're sent a copy of the sheet. So we copy it and share it with that person. And there's two ways we do it, depending on Sometimes if people just want to be given it and then left alone to their own devices, that's fine. Alternatively, we sort of stay with them for a little bit of time and then just hand shoot over when they know how to use it. But yeah, it's all available there. And that's entirely however want to use it. A question from Claire, do students have access? That's something I've not done yet, but it's something I'm very keen to do, and that would be quite interesting to work out ways of either embedding in students' LMSs or VLEs or how they can then work. But that's something I'm keen to do, definitely. So there's a question around a logistical question, copying things across. Yes, that's straightforward. One can copy things across. Alternatively, if you literally just have a few different modules, you can just literally take a copy of the entire sheet, rename it with something else, and then off you go, and that will work very well there. Okay, so a question on sort of synoptic assessment, an assessment that spans a module. That one is a little bit tougher in this sort of visualization. I think you're right, it would be absolutely brilliant to be able to see that. The ways I would probably say to do it at the moment is when creating your assessment types, either by naming that assessment so it gets a bespoke color, and then the modules, which are, whether that assessment then spans the modules, that color can then be used as that link. And sort of an activity that one could do with students, which would be, sounds a little bit weird, but actually giving students the ability to interact with a digital map, but actually potentially a paper copy in a classroom where they can then sort of annotate it and draw on it and draw these lines and activities around and so forth. Can one highlight core modules? The easiest way to do that one would be when you are putting in your module title, just literally at the beginning, probably type course in capitals, COR, and then the module title would be one way of doing it, or a C, then a space, and so forth. That's probably the easiest way to do that one. Interesting question from Trish. Any thoughts on mapping against learning outcomes? That's a question I've been asked before, and it's something that we definitely need to make more overt. Here, for example, looking at what we're mapping at the moment, the tool won't do that one, but it's definitely on my list of things to try and work out how to do, because I think that's exceptionally important for sort of student assessment literacy and also seeing how things are fitting together, and particularly linking program outcomes to module outcomes to assessment activity. So again, going back to that big picture, this is your degree. That's something I'm very keen on trying to work out. If anyone's got any ideas around that one, I would love to hear from you, and that would be absolutely brilliant. Question from Deb: if you had a master list of subjects that you, oops, that's my document. If you have a master, sorry, I lost the question. And try again. If you had a master list of subjects that you could link from, could you view almost any combination of subjects for a course where there's many variations? At the moment, the tool is set up to do a set number of modules within a program. Technically, just adding more options and expanding that list, yes, that's very straightforward to do, and that's easy to do. Yes. A really important comment from Tim, and I definitely agree that this is really a starter for a discussion. So the workshops that we've run with people, whereby you ask people to bring in to a room their sort of module guides or their dates, and then they create their maps quite quickly, and then the discussions and the value that actually that does bring in, definitely it is really the sort of reflection, the conversations, the actually seeing it, and then the people working together to explore the assessment experience. Tim, I fully agree with you that the dialogue that engenders is really where most of the value is for a lot of people. Another tool from Matthew, which sounds brilliant. Claire, if I do work it out, I will. Any questions that I've missed? I mean, we spoke a little bit earlier on. If anyone wants to make a verbal comment or thought, you're very more than welcome. If you do so, if you just want to raise your hand so we can manage sort of microphones and so forth, that's possible too. And then question from Rachel: for a student view, what about showing when an assessment task starts to help students managing multiple deadlines? That's a really interesting point, and that's a good idea. So again, so at the moment the tool does have the sort of beginning, and then it changes colour. So that would be possible to do, and that, you're right, that would be a very exciting way of helping them manage their work, and also going back to the sort of assessment phases that we have, combining those sorts of things together. That's a really exciting idea, definitely. So, question from what sort of time frame for a session do you encourage this sort of planning to happen? So Deb, for that one, we've done it in various ways. So we've done a couple of ones whereby literally people just turn up with a laptop and it's done within the room, and we sort of said that's sort of a couple of hours probably to do that, because if people are because the tool is very straightforward and easy to use, that would work. Other times we've circulated it to program teams who can then do it in advance as well. Okay, and I think I've covered most of your questions. Matthew.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Mark. I just want to invite people to please fill out the feedback survey. That would be wonderful, either by clicking the link in the text chat, or the link on the slide is also live, since I've typed it in post slide. Any other questions? People are welcome to raise their hand with a little hands up symbol, and then we'll give you the microphone if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment. Anybody? Okay, if we're done, if no one else is having any questions, we shall close off the recording. But otherwise, thank you very much, Mark Kerrigan. Very interesting session, and hopefully we will see more of this tool in the future. Well,
thank you, and thanks again for the invitation. It's great.
Version.
Definitely. Thank you.
All right, thank you, folks. We'll be back again in roughly a month's time. Our next session is actually going to be quite interesting, because I'll be in the middle of the UK by that time. So thanks very much. I will be travelling over your side of the world, Mark, very soon. So next webinar will be hosted from the UK, somewhere in Ireland, I think, too. So anyway, thanks very much, folks, and see you next month.